Trust the Profits Breeders' Cup coverage is brought to you by PlayUp Racebook, the most horse player-friendly racebook in the industry. PlayUp Racebook is always your best bet.
He's the king of California horse racing, and he's headed to Keeneland. Let's do a Bob Baffert barn tour for the Breeders' Cup. Salutations and welcome, friends. I am your host on Countdown to Keeneland, Matthew Desantis. You can find me on Twitter at the handle Failed to Menace. Again, my favorite running line. And again, I'll tell you why one day, but not today, because today we got a lot of other content to get to, and that includes the Bob Baffert barn tour for the Breeders' Cup. That's a lot of alliterations, actually, a lot of B's. I maybe needed to do some mouth exercises before I recorded this episode, now that I think about it. But before we get to that, I want to give a big shout out to our new sponsor, PlayUp Racebook. You got to check out PlayUp Racebook. They're doing things the right way. They're a great site. Download the app for free. Sign up and deposit at PlayUp Racebook and receive a 50% deposit bonus for up to $250. And they have a Breeders' Cup special. If you deposit $100 or more before the Breeders' Cup, they will give you an additional $25 free wager. I think there's some horses that I'm going to be talking about today that might just be pretty enticing for you to place a $25 free wager on at the Breeders' Cup. So like I said, you got to go check out PlayUp Racebook. Big thanks to them for supporting Trust the Profits. And of course, make sure to like and follow Trust the Profits. Make sure to subscribe so you can find out whenever we drop new videos, which happens a few times a day. We're really churning out a lot of great Breeders' Cup content for you. Still turning out a lot of weekly content as well, just on terms of what's going on at tracks around the country. Daily doubles with Colin. I'll still be doing Capping the Card this week, probably going out to Santa Anita. And they have a few graded stakes races out there. So going to be capping some West Coast racing. But today, we're going to talk about the king of the West Coast, and that is, of course, Bob Baffert, and doing a barn tour of his fleet of horses that he will be bringing to Keeneland for the 2022 Breeders' Cup coming up on November 4 and 5. It is exciting to do these. Remember, I already did one on Charlie Appleby, so you can go back and watch that if you're interested. I just dropped one on Brad Cox the other day in his barn as well. So Baffert is the third in this series, but we're still going to have more. We're going to do Steve Asmussen. We're going to do Todd Pletcher. We're going to do Chad Brown. We're going to do Aiden O'Brien. Look for all of those in the coming days. And if you have recommendations for other barn tours you'd like me to do before the Breeders' Cup, happy to do those as well. I know somebody mentioned Todd Fincher in the comments. That's a really good idea, actually. Senior Buscador and Slammed. I mean, that's a barn that doesn't get a lot of press, but he's got two really live horses, I think, in two significant Breeders' Cup events this year. So a lot of great stuff here. But like I said, let's dive into Baffert today. And, listen, Bob Baffert is a polarizing figure in horse racing. That said, I was screaming my head off and going nuts when American Pharoah won the Triple Crown. I was excited when Justified won, or Justify, I should say, won. And he's a figure, again. I understand why there's a lot of division over how people feel about him. But what you cannot do is ignore the horses that he's bringing to the Breeders' Cup. And you cannot ignore the quality, particularly of his juvenile crops every single year. He's got some really live juveniles and great 2-year-olds, and that's no different again this year. So we're going to dive in, do a barn tour of the horses that he's bringing to the Breeders' Cup, and also talk a little bit about the horses he's not bringing to the Breeders' Cup, because there are some 2 notable exceptions that are not going to be coming. But in all, Baffert has, I believe, 5 horses coming to this year's Breeders' Cup, and shockingly, one of them is actually on turf. You don't think of Bob Baffert as a turf trainer, and he's not a turf trainer. But we'll get into that very unique case of why you have a Baffert horse running on the turf here in a second. But as always, let's dive into just a general overview. And these statistics are since the year 2000. But since 2000, Baffert's had 100 Breeders' Cup starters. Just an incredible amount, of course, averaging close to 5 a year since 2000 till this coming year in 2022. So, he's bringing 4 or 5 horses every single year, it feels like. He's got 14 wins, 13 places, 6 shows. So his winning percentage is only about 14%, even though he's got a ton of wins, obviously, 14 Breeders' Cup wins. And he's got 16 overall, I should make note of, but 14 since 2000. It's a 14% win rate. Again, when we talk about some of these other barns, Charlie Appleby, he doesn't bring many horses over, but he's winning at a 56% clip. Brad Cox has just kind of exploded onto the scene the last few years. He's winning at a 31% clip. So Baffert actually is winning at a slightly reduced clip, but what you see there is Baffert horses run well underneath as well. 13 seconds, 6 thirds. So his horses are always very competitive. Like I said, you get about a third of the time in the money at the Breeders' Cup, but of course, running against the best of the best is always quite significant. Obviously, some recent notable winners. Corniche last year in that Breeders' Cup Juvenile. That race has come back extraordinarily soft. Corniche has already been retired, of course, after a very poor effort at the Amsterdam. As a 3-year-old, obviously switching barns to Todd Pletcher in the wake of all of the controversy around Baffert for the positive test of Medina Spirit and the ban from running in Kentucky and New York, etc. But before that, you look at a horse like Gamine, Authentic, Arrogate, American Pharaoh, Bayern. I mean, he went on that 3-year run of Bayern, American Pharaoh, and Arrogate winning back-to-back-to-back Breeders' Cup Classics. Very impressive. And that was, like I said, really when his barn hit full stride, that kind of 2014 to 2016 time period is when he had a lot of his success. And so, like I said, very notable barn and very notable horses that are on the tips of everyone's tongue, and horses that a lot of common people know about because of the Kentucky Derby, because of the Triple Crown races. People know about American Pharaoh. People still know about Arrogate. People obviously know a little bit about Authentic. People know about some of these horses. Just your casual fans, if you're talking to your friends and family, they know who Bob Baffert is. They know what these horses are. So it's important to know what horses he's going to be bringing this year. So as I mentioned, he's bringing 5 starters to this year's Breeders' Cup, but you'll notice 2 names that are not on the list. One of those is Country Grammar, and the other is Defunded. Both of those horses appeared pointed toward the Breeders' Cup Classic. In fact, one point, I remember back in, I believe, March or April, somebody said that Country Grammar was the early favorite for the Breeders' Cup Classic. This is why we don't make prognostications back in March and April about a race that's going to take place in November. Defunded, of course, won the Win and You're In for the Breeders' Cup Classic that was held at Santa Anita just a few weeks ago. However, neither of them will be headed there this year. Country Grammar, as Baffert said, seems a little tired. That second place effort last time out was something that he was, I think, pretty concerned about. And then Defunded seems to just be a head case. And Defunded seems to be a horse that just likes Santa Anita and nowhere else. He apparently completely freaked out and had a meltdown in the paddock at Del Mar. And I think Baffert's just worried about bringing him to Keeneland and what sort of mental condition the horse is going to be in for that race. And so Defunded is a horse that puts it all together at Santa Anita, but really, if you look at his running lines, does not run well at a lot of other places. So, I think that for those of us sometimes who are a little quizzical about why Defunded has not run better in the past, a lot of times it's because he's just worked up and he doesn't like his surroundings, and he really likes Santa Anita. That's where he's comfortable. Like I said, so Baffert's decided not to bring those 2 horses to the Classic. As a result, his headliner that he's bringing is, of course, Tabo. Going to that Classic race is going to be challenging Flightline, Life is Good, Epicenter, the other big favorites there. Tabo absolutely deserves to be right there in discussion with all of those other 3. I actually think is probably a more realistic threat to Flightline than a horse like Life is Good, actually. I'm actually a little less bullish on Life is Good. I think Life is Good at 10 furlongs has a lot of susceptibility. I like Flightline. I like Epicenter. I like Tabo. Those are the 3 that I really like in this race. And I think Tabo is a good enough horse. Can he pull off the monumental upset of Flightline? Maybe not. But I think Tabo is going to absolutely give it a run. This is a really good horse. I was so impressed by that effort on Pennsylvania Derby Day, where obviously last time out winning the Grade 1 Pennsylvania Derby, I was there that day. Tabo just looked like $1 million, and it just ran like a 2. Just such a great great effort. And it was not necessarily the ride that I thought Tabo would want to get either. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But obviously, there's some other horses Baffert's bringing. Laurel River, likely pointed towards the dirt mile. Now, it is going to probably be pre-entered in the sprint as well. That sprint is getting crowded, shall we say, with horses that are pointed in that direction. You look at a horse like Jackie's Warrior, obviously, but then you got Cody's Wish. It looks like Jack Christopher's going to the sprint. Gunite might even be a late addition to the sprint. American Theorem is probably going to be going to the sprint. It just feels like there's a lot of horses going to the sprint, and Laurel River might be best at that dirt mile. I have a feeling that's where this horse is going to be pointed. We talked about this a little bit with Cyberknife with the Brad Cox Barn Tour, but that dirt mile feels a little bit softer. Feels like a good chance for Laurel River to potentially get a Breeders' Cup victory. And of course, finished first last time out at that Pet O'Brien Stakes, which is a grade 2 win, and you're in. And then Baffert has three juveniles that are all extraordinarily talented. You have Cave Rock, National Treasure, and Speedboat Beach. Cave Rock, of course, the winner, very impressive fashion of the American Pharaoh, has reeled off 2 +100 Beyer speed figures in his first three career races. The race in which he did not run a 100+ Beyer speed figure, he ran a 98. This is an extraordinarily fast horse. National Treasure, running only his second race at that American Pharaoh, finished second to Cave Rock, ran, I thought, very impressively in second place as well. This is a horse I really like actually next year even more. I think National Treasure is going to mature beautifully as a 3-year-old. And then you have Speedboat Beach, which is going to be running in the juvenile turf sprint, won the Speakeasy Stakes last time out, which is a listed stakes race. And this is a prime example of the embarrassment of riches that Baffert has, and also the unique nature of the Breeders' Cup divisions. We've talked about this before, that the juvenile does not have a sprint division for dirt horses. There is only the juvenile turf sprint. Speedboat Beach is a dirt horse, full stop. But Baffert and probably the ownership group wanted to see if they could get this horse into the Breeders' Cup at a sprint race. As a result, they ran this horse on the turf at the Speakeasy Stakes. This is a horse that ran a 100 Beyer speed figure first time out on the dirt, breaking its maiden, then comes back, runs an 81 Beyer speed figure on the turf, but notably wins the race and wins the win and you're in. And so is qualified for this juvenile turf sprint and is probably one of the top American turf horses in this particular race, just because this horse does have overwhelming speed. And in a turf sprint, you can get away with these dirt to turf transitions, particularly at juveniles, a little bit easier. But let's do a deep dive into each one of these 5 horses. So let's start with Tabo, obviously the horse that generated so much buzz in only its second career effort. Tabo, of course, is a gun runner progeny. Gun runner that day at Pennsylvania Derby Day. It was a great, amazing day for gun runners in general, because of course Society won the cotillion just less than an hour before the Pennsylvania Derby. That Society, of course, is a gun runner as well, who's going to be going to the Breeders' Cup Distaff. Tabo then wins. Then you had Echo Zulu win a graded stakes race later that evening at Churchill Downs. You had Gunite win a stakes race at Churchill Downs. You also had a Tom Amos gun runner that won a stakes race. I'm forgetting the name of that horse off the top of my head, but 5 stakes wins for gun runner in one day. And so it was a really, like I said, incredible effort on that Pennsylvania Derby day. But listen, Tabo burst onto the scene in that Santa Anita Derby. Obviously, it was so impressive in that maiden, but really that Santa Anita Derby, a lot of people thought Tabo was just going to be kind of the cheap speed and was going to try to wear out Forbidden Kingdom so that Messier, his stablemate, could get the win. Well, nobody told Tabo that. Tabo actually sat a very mature trip, sat third, let Forbidden Kingdom go out front, let Messier kind of stalk Forbidden Kingdom, let those two wear each other out, and then came around and came late and passed Messier, won that Santa Anita Derby, went into the Kentucky Derby. Obviously didn't have a great effort that day, finished 12th, but honestly was not nearly as bad as some of the other horses in that race. I thought that was not an awful 12th place finish in the Derby, all things considered. Comes back in the Haskell, looks like he's got, he certainly had Jack Christopher dead to rights. gets past Jack Christopher. And then, of course, we've talked all the time about Cyberknife sneaking up the rail and getting that win. Mike Smith going outside, making the decision to take Taba outside, going around that final turn. Florent Giroux takes Cyberknife inside, going around that turn. That really may end up being the difference in the race. That said, Tabo was a horse at that point that did not like getting a lot of kickback, does not like getting a lot of dirt in its face. Also doesn't necessarily like the tight spaces all the time. So I think Mike Smith actually did the right thing. I know a lot of people criticize him, but I think he did the right thing that day for the horse, that the horse didn't want to go inside, didn't want to get kicked back, wanted to go outside, wanted to be in the free and clear. Now, that may have ultimately costed the horse the race, but that's what the horse wanted to do. You can say, well, you can make the horse do what it doesn't want to do. You can, but there are repercussions to that as well. And does the horse really explode through the way that you would hope? That's what made the Pennsylvania Derby so impressive to me, was that Taba sat inside in the second flight in a stalking position, was taking kickback. It was not the sort of trip that you would think Taba would like, and yet he really showed so much ability, so much resilience, and just a stunning turn of foot when he turned on that accelerator and went past everyone else coming for home. So Taba winning that race by open lengths over Zandon, by a pretty good margin over Cyberknife and Simplification. And so, certainly is a horse worthy of discussion for winning this Breeders' Cup Classic. If you are trying to fade Flightline, then I think you have to look at Taba as a horse that could potentially do it, especially if you think, and I think the race that I would go back to is actually the second race in this horse's career. If Taba can run the type of race he ran at the Santa Anita Derby, I think that's the perfect race. I think it is let Flightline and Life is Good go out, and you have to kind of hope Life is Good goes out with Flightline. That if Life is Good tries to sit or just stalk, that's not going to work because Flightline, you can't just let Flightline be alone in the lead and just be easy. It's a little bit like Nick's Go last year. If you let that horse alone in the lead, then the race is over. So if Life is Good challenges Flightline, though, then I think Taba sits that third place trip, and suddenly, crazier things have happened. Now, listen, do I think from a probability standpoint, Flightline's going to win? Yes, I do. But I think that there's a real legitimate argument and case to be made that Taba is a huge threat in this race. So certainly a very, very talented horse. All these gun runners are so talented, and great to see Taba running in this particular race. Well, let's go to Laurel River, who I feel like is probably the most overlooked of all the Baffert horses. I feel like Speedboat Beach, Cave Rock, and National Treasure, the juveniles, actually all maybe get a little bit more name recognition than Laurel River. But that's because Laurel River took a huge layoff. So if you notice in the running lines, Laurel River had a kind of a nice campaign in 2021, got a couple of wins, but got a second in a grade 3, but then took off for a full year almost. Went from September 6th till July 31st of this past year. So basically 11 months. Took 11 months off, comes back, wins an allowance race, and then goes out in that Pat O'Brien and wins impressively over American Theorem, who in his own right had just won a win in your in race. I think Laurel River is, like I said, an exceptionally good horse. I actually think the sprint might not be ideal for him. I think he actually likes a little bit more distance. He is a little bit of an unusual horse. We've talked about it with Cody's Wish and Gunite. He is a horse that does seem like 7 furlongs is probably his ideal distance, or a 1-turn mile. Of course, at Keeneland, the dirt mile will be a 2-turn mile. That's something to take into consideration. I'm sure the Baffert barn and the ownership group is weighing, but I just feel like 6 furlongs may not be ideal for Laurel River. I think he likes that extra furlong. If you look at his running lines, he's won 3 times at 7 furlongs or a mile. And so I feel like he does like a little bit more distance. I think that's why he's going to be so effective at the mile distance. But that's not a particularly strong field. We've talked about that before, that dirt mile. Laurel River is absolutely talented enough to win that race. It's going to be very well rested. It's going to be coming off a long layoff, obviously. One of the things you should notice as well in that Pat O'Brien, not only do you see the second place horses, American Theorem, notice who the third place horses, Senior Buscador. That's right, the Senior Buscador, who qualified for the Breeders' Cup by winning a win in your in race at Keeneland. So this is, that Pat O'Brien race has come back extremely strong. And I think Laurel River is a horse that absolutely needs to be talked about when discussing dirt mile contenders. Certainly one of the 2 or 3 favorites in that particular race. Well, let's get down to the juveniles, and we'll start with the one who has really just wowed people, and that is Cave Rock. 3 for 3 winning, has never been challenged seriously, has put away most of the other top contenders in the West Coast, including some of his own barn mates, and having a meltdown. National Treasure, Hijazi. Cave Rock is a fantastic horse. Let that be absolutely said. He is a fantastic horse. Um, a mile and a 16th is an ideal distance, I think, for him. Obviously, was able to demonstrate the 2 turns was not a problem last time around. That said, one could make an argument that that was a very easy prep for him. That Baffert had 4 horses in that race, and you could not help but see that Cave Rock looked like he was almost being escorted around the track by the 3 other Baffert horses: National Treasure, Hijazi, and Gandolfini, the other Baffert horse. All 4 of them ran 1, 2, 3, 4. Nobody put undue pressure on Cave Rock. Cave Rock ran very fast fractions, but Santa Anita always runs fast. So, it's not as if he was. So I don't want to misrepresent things. It's not as if Cave Rock was running a New York turf race, okay, and going incredibly slow fractions up front. He was running honest fractions, but there's a big difference between running honest fractions and running contested fractions. Those were certainly not contested fractions in the same way a horse like Loggins, let's say, was contested that same day at Keeneland in a win and you're in race. So, Cave Rock was able to run a very easy race. Obviously, now you come to the juvenile, there's going to be more horses. Baffert only has one other horse in the field, National Treasure, who we'll get to in a second. There might be a little bit more pressure up front. Cave Rock is a horse that wants to run to the lead. This could be susceptible. Now, speed has been very, very good at Keeneland, but still, if you put a lot of pressure on these horses, you never know how they're going to respond, particularly for horses that have not had to deal with adversity before. That said, Cave Rock is incredibly impressive. I mean, to run 2 100 plus buyer speed figures in his first 3 career races, I mean, we were getting late into the Derby season before any of the 3-year-olds this year cracked 100. And now we have a 2-year-old that's cracking 100. So, and multiple 2-year-olds. So, that is, you can't overstate how effective Cave Rock was as a juvenile in these first couple of races. Now, if there's one concern that I do have, and I probably have a little bit more concern about this than some, up top, Cave Rock has impeccable pedigree, descendant from Arrogate, but underneath, Cave Rock's dam was a pure sprinter. Now, she does have distance influence. Obviously, her sire was Bellamy Road, who, was a classic distance horse. So Cave Rock probably, if you dig into the dam's pedigree, yes, there's classic distance running in that pedigree. That said, you do wonder, is he going to adopt more of a sprinter's pedigree later on? Is this a horse that will stretch out as a 3-year-old to a mile and an eighth, a mile and a quarter? It's a question we'll just have to wait and see. But I think at a mile and a 16th will be understandably the favorite in this race. Well, his barn mate, National Treasure, will probably be the second choice in this race. And National Treasure is a horse that I actually like a little bit more. I think this horse is impeccably bred. I think the pedigree underneath just screams distance. This horse will get better the more and more it stretches out. But you can see it goes from breaking its maiden in a 6.5 furlong sprint at Del Mar to then running second at Cave Rock in that mile and a 16th effort at the American Pharoah Stakes in the Grade 1. And what impressed me was the way that this horse beat Hijazi. Hijazi was a little bit more experienced actually going into this race, had 2 races under his belt as opposed to only 1 for National Treasure. I was always higher on National Treasure than Hijazi, who's another horse that is impeccably bred up top, but does have sprinter pedigree underneath. National Treasure, impeccably bred both up top and underneath for distance and classical distance. So National Treasure is a horse that's going to sit a little bit more, doesn't need to lead. I actually think the juvenile could set up very nicely for National Treasure in that regard if there's a little bit too much pace up front in this particular field. And that does tend to be the case with juveniles, that they like to get out. They like a lot of these really good 2-year-olds. They like to be out and they like to be on the lead. Well, they can't all be on the lead. We saw what happens when everybody tries to get to the lead, and that was called the 2022 Kentucky Derby. When everybody tries to get to the lead and there's a breakneck pace, what happens? The horses that are off the pace end up benefiting from that. Nothing's going to look quite like that 2022 Derby, but if there is that early speed, Cave Rock gets challenged, gets pushed by some of these other horses, then suddenly National Treasure, I think, has a chance to sit a very good trip and be a real contender in this race. So let's go to the final of Baffert's 5 horses, which is Speedboat Beach, and maybe the most interesting horse and certainly the most interesting dynamic in this particular case, qualifying obviously for the juvenile turf sprint. This is a dirt horse, though. Make no mistake about it. You'll notice first time out beat Hijazi, who finished 3rd in the American Farrow Stakes. So was, just such an impressive debut at 5.5 furlongs on the dirt. This is a horse that does seem like it is bred specifically to sprint. This is not going to be a horse next year that's on the Derby trail. I would not imagine, at least. This horse does feel as if this is a one-turn horse. That said, like I said, the ownership groups realized the only way to get this horse to the Breeders' Cup was in a sprint race. How do you get a juvenile horse into a sprint race? You put it on the grass because that's the only division that there is for the juveniles. So that's what they did in the Speakeasy Stakes, and amazingly, this horse won. Now, I said there was a huge drop-off in speed figure. Ran 100 first time out, ran an 81 on the turf. Here's the thing, that 81 on the turf is still extremely competitive with some of the best turf horses that we have in this particular race. So, a horse like Nagarok, who won a stakes race, who won a turf sprint stakes race at Aqueduct just a couple weeks ago, ran an 83 in that race. And that's a horse that's bred for the turf. So Speedboat Beach absolutely is comparable in this spot. The other piece of information that I think is very important here is there's a very important scratch that happened earlier today. Aidan O'Brien's very celebrated 2-year-old Blackbeard, who was one of the odds-on favorites to win this juvenile turf sprint, has been retired. He hurt himself, and he is going straight out to stud and to sire. So Blackbeard will not be running in the juvenile turf sprint. That means the only other major European threat is the Platinum Queen, who's had gait issues in the past, although she's extraordinarily talented. So suddenly there's not a lot up top in that race. I think a lot of us hold the Platinum Queen in very high regard, but then you look at Speedboat Beach, you look at Tyler's Tribe, you look at maybe a couple of Wesley Ward horses like Love Reigns. So there's a couple of those, but this is a field that's absolutely open. And the irony, of course, would be that Bob Baffert, really always a dirt trainer, I should say, ends up winning a juvenile stakes race for the Breeders' Cup on the turf in the turf sprint. Crazier things have happened for sure. I mean, this horse will have to, get the right trip. We'll have to like that Keeneland turf, which is very different from that Santa Anita turf. But like I said, still a very important contender to keep in mind as we close up and get closer to the Breeders' Cup. Well, that is the Bob Baffert Barn Tour. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Like I said, diving deep on those horses is always fun for me. And before we leave you today, just a quick reminder to check out PlayUp Racebook and receive a 50% deposit bonus up to $250. And if you deposit $100 or more before the Breeders' Cup, they will give you an additional $25 free wager. So definitely want to make sure you check out PlayUp Racebook because they have a lot of great stuff. They have a lot of great features. They have a lot of great content. They're trying to do right by the players and the bettors, and that's always the most important thing, in my opinion, at least, when looking at all these different race books that are out there. So PlayUp Racebook, make sure to check them out. And a big thanks again to them for supporting Trust the Profits. Before I leave, just a quick reminder to like and subscribe this video, comment below with who you're looking forward to watching in the Bob Baffert Barn, and let us know what other barn tours you would like to see. Make sure to follow me on Twitter at the handle @FailedToMenace for all of the great content that I'm putting out. And this is going to be a really fun last 2 weeks, folks. So buckle up. We got a ton of content here for you on Trust the Profits. And until next time, it's now post time.
Trust the Profits Breeders' Cup coverage is brought to you by PlayUp Racebook, the most horse player friendly racebook in the industry. PlayUp Racebook is always your best bet.